So this is more or less my plan for today. I'll be telling you about two experiential teaching approaches that my colleague and I have developed and or implemented, and how we believe they can help facilitate human behavior change, especially compared to traditional classroom-based approaches. In this work, our focus has been on farm animals and specifically pigs, in part because we are at an agricultural university, so it makes sense, we have those resources, but other reasons make agricultural animals a priority, such as the increasing intensification of animal agriculture globally, coupled with a steady rise in demand for animal products, and the increasing distance, both geographical and relational, between animals and the general public. This requires that we reevaluate our interactions with farm animals, including approaches to teaching about human-animal relationships and how those relationships ultimately affect the welfare of animals and their communities. Specifically, our proposal focuses on teaching with animals rather than about animals, and I hope that's made somewhat clear throughout the presentation. And this is an attempt to break down that subject-object boundary that often prevents us from thinking about animals as morally considerable others. The approaches I will describe were designed to teach animal ethics and introductory sociological concepts to college students. We propose that these teaching approaches are consistent with some of the central constructs of human behavior change, and I will be using the trans-theoretical model, which other speakers have mentioned, to briefly explain how we think this works. All right, so as I mentioned, I'll be talking about two alternatives for teaching animal ethics and sociological concepts. One of those is face-to-face human-animal interactions coupled with personal narratives of these interactions, what in the social sciences is also known as autoethnography. And the second approach involves reflective encounters with animal portraits. You will notice that in describing the first approach, I'll be referring to my colleague's experience using it, first in her own research and then in her teaching. And the second approach, which is my own, is still very much a work in progress, so I'll be referring to work that informs it rather than my own experience putting it into practice, which is as of yet limited. And I also apologize in advance, but I'll be reading through much of the next section because it is my colleague's part and she's not here, so. All right, so as a graduate student, Jennifer Kelly conducted participant observation methods as part of the community of the Pasture Pig Project at MSU's student organic farm. Her field notes were evaluated as part of this assignment, and this allowed her to interact with farm animals and experience life through their lens. Following are her notes from time she spent with Ruby. Ruby was one of the sows that was part of this pasture pig project, and she had just birthed a litter of piglets at this time. So I'm going to quote here. I noticed a certain sound Ruby makes when she greets me. Last night she greeted me. Intuitively, I felt it. The amazing moments in time with the non-human animal dwell in the space of allowing the human animal to reconnect to certain feelings, certain instincts that seem as though they are long forgotten. Animals remind us we are connected. Ruby and I know each other. It's not just that I know her, but she knows me, and I felt that last night. It was as if she wanted me to see her babies, to show them off. I sat in the little nook with the piglets. Ruby's nose peered under the wooden boundary to meet the soft, innocent skin of one of her babies, while exposure to the heat lamp penetrated her nose, her weathered, tired, mothered skin. End quote. This narrative is reflective of an understanding that she was communicating with a pig, that they had a relationship. The experience then inspired her, to create the same kind of experiences in her teaching. She used the approach in a course entitled Animals, People, and Nature, in which students are generally required to conduct 20 hours of service for a nonprofit organization. Following is an excerpt from one of her students' writing, a student who volunteered at an adoption event for cats. And in this writing, the student describes the cats as tired. Quote, I don't use tired here as a description for someone lacking sleep, like me. I use tired to describe their loss of hope the hope they previously had to find a permanent home and leave their approximately 3 by 4 foot temporary one. I was anthropomorphizing cats in this instance, but I feel this is something humans instinctively do with their pets and other domestic animals. When I looked into the eyes of these cats, I see the eyes of someone who has given up. This description doesn't do the experience justice. Despite having a good experience volunteering, I couldn't help but become saddened when I had to leave the cats behind. They were left to their cages that would soon be blanketed by darkness as the pet store closed their doors and shut off their lights. As demonstrated here, the student is reflecting on their anthropomorphism of cats who long for a forever home, and this experience invoked personal emotions that connect to feelings of empathy, which we just talked about not too long ago. These personal connections create an enduring learning experience. The opportunity for face-to-face interactions and the use of personal narratives within the field notes provides a space for emotional as well as intellectual outcomes in understanding the human-animal interface, arguably providing that enduring educational experience we're talking about. Within a human behavior change framework, the change achieved would possibly be located somewhere between the contemplative and preparation stages, and I'll refer to that model in a little bit. And that depends a lot on where the individual student is located at that time. All right, the second method, as I mentioned, which is my own, involves the use of animal portraits and personal meaning maps. The personal meaning map, for those of you who are not familiar, is a simple research tool that involves collecting information on people's immediate reactions to an intervention. This could be exposure to a photograph, a video, or an experience. Generally, it involves taking a single piece of paper and writing a single word or simple phrase on it in the middle of the paper. Then you ask the participants to write down all of their gut reactions to that word within a very short time span. This happens very quickly. Then you have the experience or exposure to whatever intervention you're using, and you can use a post-test. You can do a post-test using the same tool. It is also important to point out that in this case, the animal portraits I'm referring to differ significantly from other kinds of animal photography. In initial studies using this method, a photographer, Joe Zamet-Lucia, used studio portrait techniques generally used for human portraits in order to emphasize the animal's individuality. These can include a focus, for example, on facial features like you see in this picture and expressions, as well as the elimination through photo editing of any natural elements in the background so that the animal is just not part of a natural landscape. If you can imagine a human portrait, often they do have these very neutral, dark backgrounds, and then the focus on the individuality of the person is much stronger. So a similar technique can be applied to animals, even though we can't really take them into photo studios. Okay. So one of the important effects of using these techniques is the blurring of the line between the observer and the observed, which affects the way the viewer understands the animal as either subject or object. And this can have other important effects, such as valuing an animal differently. The researchers who carried out this initial research, Linda Kaloff, Joe Zamet-Lucia, and Jennifer Kelly, studied the effects of animal portraits on viewers' perceptions of animals in a natural history museum setting, so they were not in a classroom. One of the main goals of their research was to gather evidence on how visual representations of animals change or reinforce the viewer's cultural perceptions of them. Their findings showed that after being exposed to a portrait, and they used portraits of wild animals in this case, viewers' perceptions of them tended to shift from the natural to the cultural realms, from object to subject, and included aspects of the viewer's frame of reference. So viewers referred to previous experiences or notions that they had about these animals, as well as what were perceived to be the artist's goals. So the artist's goals also kind of came through in the personal meaning maps that they used. Now, I teach ethics, so considering the goals of teaching ethics, these outcomes seem particularly favorable in light of the role that valuing plays within ethical theory and practice. In addition to these results, another likely outcome of the approach is an integration of intellectual and emotional responses, which are often intentionally decoupled in other kinds of intellectual exercises we might use in an ethics class, such as case studies or philosophical deliberation. Ethics as a normative rather than a descriptive discipline aims not only to deliver factual information, so we're not only providing knowledge, but we're also recommending and motivating action. According to some research in moral psychology, motivation is strongly informed by emotion as opposed to reason. So that's why I believe it's very important to foster these emotional responses in students if we are, again, to have a truly lasting educational experience. Okay, so how does this connect to HPC? And I'll do that quite quickly because I think I'm running short on time. So I've described these two approaches that include using different kinds of experiences to motivate critical thinking about animals from a place of both reason and emotion. And I would like to go back to this concept of experience. So what is exactly an experience? Here's a definition from John Dewey, an American philosopher and educator. He wrote a lot about experience, although not necessarily clearly. So I think what he's trying to say here is that experiences are not just interactions with our environment, but they're rather transactions. So anytime I'm having a true experience, I'm bringing something to the table and I'm also taking something away. In order to say that I've had an experience, and that exchange must occur between myself and some other entity in a particular environment. And again, I'm not arriving empty-handed, so we all have some sort of baggage that we're already bringing. And examples of this baggage are assumptions that we would try to tease out using a tool like the personal meaning map. So the next question I'm attempting to answer is, how does this model of experience help explain whether or not experiential learning is actually useful in facilitating human behavior change? In order to try to answer that, on this slide I have on the right side, I think, an adaptation of the stages of change. This is based on the trans-theoretical model. And on the left, an expanded model of the cycle of experience, which is kind of many instances of the model I showed in the previous slide. So, and I'm sorry that's a bit unclear, but basically each one of those loops is one of the cycles of experience. So you have the experience, you reflect on it, you make some generalizations, and then the cycle continues. You continue having experiences and even integrating those into other experiences. Okay, so this part of the reflection part of the process, for instance, if we look at that, all these cycles, these loops, the reflection part of the process would occur, for instance, during the writing of personal narratives, if we think about the first model I talked about, or after an intervention in the animal portraits case. What I want to think about specifically is, what does experiential learning help us do? Is it moving from a pre-contemplative state to a contemplative one, or something of a higher order? And again, it of course depends very much on our audience. So in my case, I teach ethics to students ranging from first-year college students to students in medical or veterinary programs, so there's a wide range. But even in the more advanced students, I believe that we are probably still working at the lower levels of that pyramid of the stages of change. And therefore, we should focus on experiences, creating and providing experiences that can move students from a pre-contemplative phase to that contemplative one, and then later on toward action. Which brings me to some conclusions. So far, I've argued that these approaches that I described allow the development of greater moral complexity regarding intrinsic and instrumental value of farm animals in this case, but we can extrapolate that, as well as a renewed understanding of the human-animal relationship overall. Both teaching approaches that I described address other central concepts to human behavior change, so process, by favoring activities that foster reflective change rather than those focused on knowledge acquisition. Also, learning environment. Our case requires non-hierarchical horizontal learning environments where learners are largely responsible for the direction of their own learning. And this, of course, leads to ownership, which is a third central concept here in behavior change. Furthermore, we argue that the use of these experiential approaches to incorporate sociological and ethical concepts in animal science and animal welfare education may help solve issues such as the tendency to rationalize situations involving animals that result in value conflicts. Some takeaway points that I want to finish up with are here on this slide. So these theoretical models of human behavior change can help us kind of understand and better plan our educational interventions if we want to use experiential education. Of course, the goals should be adequate for each one of the stages of HBC. So if what we are attempting is to move from pre-contemplative to contemplative, we would adjust those experiences accordingly. And as I just described, not all hands-on learning, not all activities are experiences. So that transaction is required. We have to acknowledge that the participant is bringing something to the table and we are intending for that participant to take something away. So we would make sure to construct the experiences accordingly. Here are some references, which I'm happy to share with you later, as I realize the font is probably quite small. And finally, I would like to thank the people mentioned here on this slide, as well as the Animal Studies Specialization at Michigan State, and one anonymous sponsor who may or may not be here. Thank you for allowing me to be here today and share this with you. And I would like to thank also my partner, Pablo, who took all of the lovely pictures of pigs you just saw. And to all of you, thank you for listening.